Okay, this is Egotism. This video is going to be a presentation about the egotism's axioms, definitions, and deductions. They're pretty. This is the foundation of ego-utilitarianism, or egotism, as I call it in short. Okay, so let's get started. So it's very important to, if a philosophy is going to be mathematical in nature, it must have very well-defined axiom definitions and valid theorems and deductions. So axiom, definition, and theorems, deductions of mathematics. So ego-utilitarianism assumes, like theorems of mathematics, including game theory, it assumes that they're valid and should be used as a basis of any reasoning. So I forgot to mention that this is a very preliminary set of axioms and definitions and logical conclusions. I just wanted to present just somewhat of a rough framework of what I'm going to be building off of in the future. So this is going to be a series, and you're going to see my axioms, definitions, and theorems. They're going to evolve, right? And I'm going to have to eventually do the hard work and actually prove these theorems from rigorous definition and axiom. So I have a specific definition of utilitarianism that I won't get into here because I want to get through this whole jumbled list. This is just a list of brainstorming, but I don't want to get into my definition of utilitarianism. But it has to do with my profit function. It's a specific weighting on it's how you distribute weighting for all the metaselves in the universe, right? So you're going to evaluate the costs and benefits for every metaself in the universe every time you act. And utilitarianism would necessarily it's somewhat poorly defined because the definition doesn't say which objective is more important, right? The greatest number of people versus the most good for the greatest amount of people. And these two are mutually exclusive conditions, right? What happens when, so for instance, you can have the most good, but not the greatest amount of people, and vice versa. You can have the greatest amount of people, but not the most good. So for instance, we've all heard that hypothetical where you're choosing between you have a runaway train, you have a lever where you can direct it to 1 or 5 people. Now the problem is, it doesn't consider like the most good, right? I mean, the weightings, right? It's assuming the weighting is equal for all people, like each person is equally weighted. But what if you got 5 delinquents on one side versus a very gifted surgeon on the other, right? Now you have a dilemma here, because obviously the good, like this guy will eventually, you can put it in terms of lives, like how many people will save, and you can do that type of question, but it's still somewhat poorly defined, right? Because what if the total good for this one person was double that of the 5 people? Now you can see a conflict here. Do I go with the greatest good, or do I go with the greatest number of people? So you can see they're mutually exclusive conditions, and you can't define something saying that you have these 2 primary objectives. So what I did was I just assumed that everyone has equal weighting, just like in a direct democracy. Everyone's vote counts the same. That's what I picture utilitarianism as. So it's a uniform distribution of metaselves. So like if you're considering just humanity, you would count everyone's good equally the same, and then maximize the total utility, right? And so even that's kind of poorly defined, because what happens when it's a tie, right? What happens when you have actually you don't have ties, but it still comes into the problem of ultimately I'm going to have to maximize good here, right? I don't care about the number of people ultimately, although the number of people necessarily is directly proportional to the weighting, because everyone's weighted equal. So obviously, like I'm going to have problems where I come up with the same value, but different number of people. Then, of course, as a tiebreaker, I picked the greatest number of people. But anyways, I'm getting too much into it, and I don't want to get too technical here. But utilitarianism has problems, right? So I wanted something more well-defined when I was constructing ego-utilitarianism, which is somewhere in the middle of egoism and utilitarianism, like valuing everyone equally. Because obviously we don't value everyone equally. I wanted to come up with something that explains how we intuitively value the cost and benefits of others, right? Like I care less about a random stranger than my family member. I care less about a random stranger versus a close friend of mine. No, the problem is, okay, now I'm going to have to compare my family member to my friend. And it gets even into a gray area, and a lot of other factors come into play. I don't necessarily would pick my direct family member, even though he might be my brother or my kid even. It could even be my student that I might favor, that I say morality might favor my student over even my son. And some people will call me wrong for this, but I'm prepared to accept the logical consequences of whatever the math says after I lay out these axioms and definitions. Okay, so ego-utilitarianism doesn't believe in any other valid reasoning than deduction. Right? Logic is really deduction. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as valid induction. It's a fallacy to use induction as pure as reasoning, right? There's not even induction in math, even though they call it mathematical induction. If you look at it, it's actually deduction. It's kind of used improperly, but it deductively exhausts all the set under consideration, and so it's like proof by exhaustion, and it's not really induction, right? And induction is an extrapolation beyond your data set, and it's not a valid way. It's a fallacy. It's induction fallacy. That's why they have a fallacy named after it. Okay, so axiom. Here's one of the axioms, and this is just a brainstorm. I've constructed this, waking up, writing stuff down. Everything's not in order. I tried to get in order a little, just because, but I just felt the need. I just felt the impulse to get this out, so everyone can kind of look at the general formation, even though it might not be worded rigorously yet. It's somewhat very rigorous, and you can see that. And you can see the mathematical structure here, because ultimately I intend to apply game theory to all of this and run simulations, right? So, okay, so here's an axiom. All well-defined definition, and I'm using well-defined mathematically, right? It's a function that clearly assigns it to a unique value. So well-defined is, and you can look this up on Wikipedia. It's let me see. So in mathematics, an expression is called well-defined or unambiguous if its definitions assign it a unique interpretation or value. Otherwise, the expression is said not to be well-defined or ambiguous. So you can see well-defined is a type of function, right? It assigns it to a unique value. And what definition does as a function is it should, if it's well-defined, it should take any object under consideration and classify it as either, let's say definition A, right? If it's A or not A, it should classify all objects in reality as A or not A, right? There's no neither, there's no both. It's either A or not A. So like a car, for instance, I should be able to look at something and say if it's a car or not. If I see a kid, obviously I input that into the function, the definition function. Is it a car? No. I see a Honda. Is it a car? Yes. If it's all the criteria, therefore it's an instance of that concept, or that meta self, as I like to call it in philosophy. So again, this is poorly worded because this is just like jotting down things while I'm inspired when I wake up here and there. So definition and linear combination of mutually exclusive terms, right? So in linear algebra, there's this thing called a spanning set, right? And it's kind of important in order to help construct definition. from a spanning set, you can take each element of the spanning set and create any element in that universe. And the thing is, they're mutually exclusive. So you get no conflation. That's the problem with English. Words have alternate meanings. It's often each definition somewhat intersects with other definitions, and when you get two sets that intersect and let's say they overlap greatly, there's a lot of chance in analysis that you're going to conflate the two, and this is what you want to avoid. So mutually exclusive partition of everything you want to talk about is required for rigorous analysis. Okay, so here's just an observation I noticed, and it's, conflation and definition. So definition, here's one of the critical definitions of ego-utilitarianism: the meta-self. This is the focus of the primary objective of the actor, right? It's the smallest, in terms of number of descriptors, conceptual set that contains all the descriptions that describe the object under analysis. A concept, an object, right? So it's the meta self is everything that describes you. You're a fat American, Hispanic, 23 years old, male. All the descriptors that can possibly describe you are part of this definition or meta self, and no other. If the description doesn't describe you in any way, it's not part of that definition, and that's what defines you. That's what defines the meta self. And I claim, even mimetically, genetics describe you, your genetic code describes you, your philosophy describes you, the way you behave describes you. Everything, every possible thing that differentiates you from something else helps describe you, and this is what you're actually concerned with, right? It's possible for you to care more about your philosophy than your kid, and ego-utilitarianism accounts for this, right? And that was my purpose when I created the meta self. Okay, so a well-defined meta self also has temporal components, time, like distinguishing temporal components, distinguishing the same physical object through its equivalent. Yeah, I was just writing this quickly, but ultimately, time also describes you, right? You right now versus you 10 hours ago is not the same meta self, right? If you want to be rigorous, right? You can generally classify your meta self to include all time, but then you're creating a group of you, like, and you're calling that meta self, and that's still valid, right? So meta selves can be groups of people, can be groups of objects, and it's still valid, right? So you can analyze what a group should do, because a group is the sum total of all the actions of the components. Even a society is a meta self. San Diego is a meta self. An idea is a meta self. Ego-utilitarianism is a meta self. There's no limit to the analysis you can use with ego-utilitarianism. And I really think this is somewhat of a philosophical breakthrough, if not an economic and somewhat, I don't know, it may have deeper implications than I'm aware of. I'm hoping, at least. I don't know, maybe I'm just delusional. But anyways, components of the meta self are actually supersets of the meta self. So for instance, humans, I am a subset. My meta self is a subset of the component. So it's kind of counterintuitive, just like entropy is disorder, right? I mean, and it's kind of like entropy's heading toward, it's called disorder, but it's headed toward equilibrium. Somewhat counterintuitive. So, I mean, this is why you must separate yourself from English, right? Other than basic grammar that I'm using to define and stuff, but you have to separate yourself totally from English and totally throw away any alternative definitions you're aware of and rigorously apply mine. So components of the meta selves are actually supersets of the meta self: human, libertarian, You're a subset. Your meta self is a subset of all these that may be mutually exclusive. Those supersets. No, they can't be. They can't be mutually exclusive. They must intersect because you're a subset of all these supersets. So anyways, none of the supersets. I don't know. I got to review set theory, but I don't think they can be mutually exclusive. So okay, so concepts, meta selves exist by default. So I say concepts exist by default. Concepts are not created by the mind; they are discovered. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to say that you created the car. You created an instance of the car, the automobile, but the concept of automobile, right? The definition of automobile existed before anyone even thought about it. And this is somewhat revolutionary, right? It's somewhat counterintuitive because you want to say you created the concept, you invented the concept. No, you brought into the world an instance of it. Okay, your actions did it, but the concept, you discovered it. It's just a combination. It's just like saying you discovered a quantity that was never considered. In as far as what numbers represent, quantity, right? Do you really think no one's ever thought of Google plus 1 or Google plus 2? So it's silly to say that there's a largest quantity that's ever been considered, because all you have to do is add 1 to it and it's already considered. So it somewhat goes to explain this. So concepts exist by default. They're not created by the mind. They're discovered, just like mathematics. It's discovered. That's why people can discover it independently. They're just linear combinations of simpler descriptors, and I'm not sure if there's foundational descriptors, right? So blue cat, I can put any color with any animal, and all these, if you put a matrix or a grid, these combinatorials already exist before I've considered them. Because they're just combinatorial, they're just numbers, and you can map these to the real number system. I mean the natural number system, and so that it's just like saying you discovered a quantity. That's why computers, they talk in binary, because everything can be represented quantitatively. And so one of the self beliefs is that all definition is ultimately quantitative. Okay, so what I write here: a priori is nonsensical. Our only link to the world is empirical, right? Through our sensory perception. The starting point, and even if it's genetic, it's built upon our ancestors' sensory perception and experiences. So ultimately, all knowledge comes from some type of empiricism. So a priori doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, I understand it can be deductive, but you get your deductions from axiom and definitions. And one's subjective, one's arbitrary definition. The other must come from experience, right? And it's an assumption that you can't prove axioms, or it's very seemingly true. It's very seemingly true, but you just can't. You don't have the tools to prove, or it's way too abstract, way too foundational to prove. So, ultimately, I say empiricism is the starting point of all deduction. Is the starting point of deduction is concept and definition. Whatever. I don't know what I wrote here. And empiricism and axiom. Okay. Starting point of deduction and concept and definition and empiricism and axiom. I don't know what I wrote here. That doesn't make sense. But this one does make sense. Okay. A priori is nonsensical. Nothing is deduced from just nothing, right? Ultimately, everything's deduced from experience. A priori and random mutation. Question: what the hell was I thinking here? Nothing is random. And I'll get to this when I come to determinism. A priori is not compatible with determinism. Okay, I got to it. But I'll define determinism very rigorously right here. So one of the axioms is evolution exists. What better axiom to start with than a scientific law? Quote unquote law, right? So evolution exists and selects for rationality, morality, profitability, and efficiency. These are all the same thing to me. These are all logically equivalent, because rationality is ultimately an appeal to profitability to some meta self, whether if your philosophy is utilitarianism, egoism, altruism, all these are types of weightings for all the meta selves out there. So like and I'll get into that somewhere. Let me just get through all this, and don't take this video seriously, but I don't know. I just wanted to get this out there. I felt the need to show some progress. Okay, so morality. Morality equals meta self existence profitability. Profitability in terms of perpetuating instances of the meta selves, right? Or for the actor, the optimum strategy to accomplish this. So evolution imposes the primary objective onto meta selves, animate or inanimate. It doesn't care if you're animate or inanimate. It selects for whatever's in existence, right? If a rock can't survive, like a particular type of rock, like it's doomed to like somehow like destroy itself, all things that fit the definition of this particular type of rock, it's gonna go extinct. And evolution doesn't care. It selects for what's in existence at any point in time. So it imposes the objective of existence or existence of instances of the meta self. It imposes you on this, right? This is the ultimate adjudicator on what's moral. It doesn't matter if you can't determine what's best for your meta self. Evolution will reward or punish you for it, whether you know it or not, in terms of opportunity costs or nominal costs or nominal profit. So the primary objective is to be moral or perpetuate existence of one's meta self or the instances of one's meta self, right? So determinism, which I assume to be, so I assume the universe to be deterministic. That means, and I have a mathematical definition, that means the probability of any well-defined event in time is either 0 or 1, nothing in between. It must be 0, 1, determined, right? Either a well-defined event is going to happen or not. Same thing, so this is throughout time, not only the future, but present and past. Obviously, the past is easy. I mean, it's intuitively easy. But to say that it is for the future or present, it was 0 or 1, right? It's determined. It's all a program. It's all simulation being run. The program's already written. The end result of the output of whatever this program spits out is determined already. Whether you know whether a human mind can calculate or not, it's already determined. Theoretically, a perfect being, a perfect omniscient being will be able to determine this, determine whatever the result or output is or the consequences. Okay, so, but determinism, but it extends beyond the events in time. And again, determinism's another equivalent to saying the world is mechanical, right? So since the universe is mechanical, it also means the probability of any well-defined event in a well-defined hypothetical. Again, well-defined is a function, right? There's no ambiguity here. You know what I'm talking about. Is either 0 or 1. So that means you can construct a hypothetical, and whether, so this is another way of saying all well-defined statements have a truth value, right? I mean, so if you do an analysis of what's going to happen in a hypothetical, it's either true or not, right? It's either 0 or 1. And the value of all well-defined strategies in a given hypothetical, real or not. So you can analyze all the strategies an actor could take, and the relative value of each strategy is determined. That means the optimum strategy is determined. Morality is defined for you, whether it is hard to calculate or not, right? Hence the relative theory of value. And again, I have a video on the relative theory of value, which is an objective theory of value, which directly says that it doesn't matter what you think value is. Absolutely does not matter, right? What matters is the real value that's associated with an action. And nature rewards and punishes you for it. And ultimately, it forces subjective value or expected value, or what actors think is valuable, it forces them to converge, because it makes the people who deviate from it go extinct. obviously, man. Okay, so necessarily follows, and therefore we can analyze what is true morality under egotism. Okay, so axiom, universe deterministic. Because see, you can see the redundancy. I just copied and pasted. Deduction. Okay, so from determinism, time travel is impossible. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean time travel, but changing events in time, right? Changing the future. That's a contradiction. Changing the past is a contradiction. Changing the present is a contradiction. You cannot change events in time. That means it has to be something. It has to be something first and then change, right? So when you take into account time as part of a definition, it cannot change. You cannot change the future. You cannot change the past. You cannot change the thing. You cannot change the present, right? So all this talk about multi-dimensions, they must be mutually exclusive from another dimensions, and you're actually not changing your dimension. If you're traveling to another dimension, which is somewhat parallel in events, only shifted in time, these two must be running parallel to each other. That's what they call it, parallel. They're not serious. They're not in any way related to each other, and that's the only way you can change, quote unquote, change events in time. But ultimately, you cannot change events in time in your own, if there are parallel universe, in your own universe, whatever you call it. Okay, so opportunity cost and determinism. What was I going there? I don't know. I think I was talking about value here. And then, so ultimately, what you, like unseen costs, I guess, I don't know. All well-defined definition of a meta self must work like a function. Okay, talked about this. Yeah, again, this is just brainstorming. So the meta self is, I was talking about, like, it could be groups, right? Groups of people, components, like a clock. Every gear is a component of the meta self of the clock. Now, the action of the meta self is the cumulative action of all its components, right? So that means a society can, so it allows to explain that government exists. Government has action because it's just a cumulative sum total of its component, the component people, all the beliefs, all the laws that they enforce. This is government, and it exists, right? Try breaking a law and see what happens. There's going to be people that enforce these laws. That's what substantiates the existence of government. Okay, so now it's important to talk about value, because it's the ultimate way of measuring anything in reality, whether it be height or morality of an action, or or the utility of a good that I'm going to get into later. So value in general is a property of a meta self. It's like a component. It's a component meta self. Simple, and you can measure it. How tall is something? How much does it weigh? What's the utility extracted from it? What time is it? I mean, what in time period is it in? What nationality is in? These are all types of values, and these are ultimately quantitative in measurement. You can express them quantitatively. That's what value is. It's a very abstract idea. So value in general is a property of the meta self and its own meta self. The mind attempts to describe concepts, meta selves, with value. So it tries to express it in terms of value. It tries to measure it, right? So that's all the mind can do. Other than opinion, it can only measure other things. Opinion is the only thing that the mind creates. And this is what I call subjectivity or arbitrariness, right? So subjective under ego-utilitarianism definition says it's synonymous with arbitrary. Okay, so all value is relative, right? And when I say so, and I have the relative theory of values, it's deduced from determinism, right? So I have a specific definition of relative. It's a mathematical function. If something's relative, it's just a math function. It's determined, right? There's a function that says what it will be if you give all the values of the determinant of the variables that determine it. the value is determined, right? So a function of 2x plus 1, if I give a value of x, the function value becomes determined. Everything's determined. So the value of an economic good is a subset of action, I claim, right? So it's not actually the good, but it's actually the action of consuming the good, right? Extracting of utility from the good, that's the value, right? So we're talking about economic value. So consuming good is a subset of action, right? So again, this falls into morality. What should you do? Which good should you buy? Which good should you buy, then consume, versus trade off and sell again? As the action is actually consuming a good, right? Okay, so I define, I've been playing around with alternate definitions of morality. So morality can be optimum strategy for the actor in terms, optimum strategy for the actor in terms of the primary objective, which again, I define as perpetuating instances of the meta-self, right? And so the meta-self is, the components of the meta-self are also weighted. And that's important because that gets into the cost-benefit analysis of the profit function, right? And the weighting is determined on how much the component is important to the existence of instances of the meta-self, right? So the leader of a group has more weighting than just an acolyte, right? Or the founder of a philosophy is more important, or even the future developers of philosophy are more important than just the follower. You can see, like, if worse came to worse, right? If for some reason a component was not seen as profitable for the rest of the meta-self, the meta-self will want to change. It'll want to replace the meta-self or kill it off. And I don't mean literally kill, but maybe just get rid of or disassociate that meta-self, that component with the entire meta-self. So this it's like democracy, but weighted to the importance of the citizen to the rest of society. So if society was a meta-self, it should run like a democracy, only weighted to the person's importance to the existence of the society itself. And I'll get into that in some other thing. Okay, so optimum strategy using game theory is measured with the egotism profit function, which is like an expected value, right? Which is like an expected value. It has the form of, it's a weighted average, right? And you can see expected value. It's going to be discrete, or if there are an infinite amount of, I don't know, it might be continuous like this, because there's an infinite amount of components that you could have. So when you consider all the meta-selves, there's an infinite amount of them, might be somewhat continuous. And if they're mapped to the real number system, if it's really expressed in binary, everything in the universe can explain in numbers, then ultimately I have to go through every number, right? I have to go through negative infinity to infinity, or whatever natural numbers, or if it's discrete, 1, 0 to infinity, or 1 to infinity. But anyways, okay, so that's just redundant here. So deduction, all rational moralities, not just egotism, so altruism, communism, utilitarianism, egoism, all these, I claim, have some form, if they're well defined, have reasoning, have cost-benefit analysis that have just different weightings, right? So my weighting obviously dissipates as you get further away from a definition, and that's how my weighting is determined. Also, how important each component is to the meta self under consideration. So if you use my relative theory of value, then it says any deviation from optimum strategy to maximize profit for the meta self is punished proportionally to the magnitude of deviation, right? So everyone always complains about, like, what if someone acts irrationally, or someone brings up an exceptional case, right? Nature takes care of this stuff, right? Bad actors go extinct. Irrational actors, unprofitable actors like government go extinct, and they go extinct as fast as how bad they act. And that's important because this is the mechanism of how you get to utopia, quote unquote, right? It's axiom. Morality must be evaluated from the meta self's perspective, right? And this is where universality comes into play. This is what makes this universal. You do not evaluate, you do not calculate the cost-benefit analysis from anyone other perspective than the actor, right? So when someone's going to murder you, you don't, even though it's intuitively somewhat disgusting, you do not evaluate morality from the victim's perspective. You evaluate it from the perpetrator's perspective. From the victim's perspective, you can only evaluate should he defend himself or not. In most cases, it should be yes. Maybe very rare circumstances it should be no, but I'll get into that some other time. So, I've been working on some new stuff because, so I'm adopting some economics, economic laws, right? So economics has the law of supply and demand. Now, I want to generalize this, right? Because conventional economics always spend all this time finding little kinks in the demand curve. And ultimately, there's a strong form of the law of demand, or what I call the strong law of utility, that generalizes demand to either all goods or utility itself. I think it's going to be utility itself, right? So an actor, it's profit, utility, relative value, and you want to maximize this. And now everything makes sense. There's no price kinks, right? And I'm not talking about price. I'm talking about pure raw utility, the usefulness of a good to perpetuate one instances of the meta self. And that's raw. That's raw. So there's no substitution effect that can take over or anything. And I'll get into that sometime, maybe in a debate. And it counts for time period of consumption, right? So law of diminishing marginal returns, law of diminishing, all this stuff applies. So from this, a weaker version emerges, a corollary, the law of supply and demand, which isn't really a law, because you can generate based upon how specifically you define a good, and you create a hypothetical with substitutes. You can create a temporary kink in the demand or supply of a good, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, but ultimately, it's just a small little error you can account for by generalizing it a little more to all of utility and include time into it. Then you have the strong law of utility, which has no exceptions, right? You cannot create a kink in this. So axiom, comparative advantage is always the case, right? So I've adopted the law of comparative advantage, and this is why we trade with people and how we're better off having other people around, right? We cannot produce everything we consume. We're dependent upon the market. And this is this is one of the foundations, or this is one of the critical things that make aggression so expensive. But not like a naptard, right? Just because aggression is expensive and should be used in rare circumstances, maybe not even so rare. I don't say all aggression is bad or immoral, right? It's all the only criteria I'm looking for is it profitable? And this is what makes it universal for everybody. I look at it from everyone's perspective. Should this actor aggress in his circumstance, even though it's against me? I do not take into account my cost-benefit analysis. I do, but in a different weighting from his perspective, from the actor's perspective. So comparative advantage is always the case, right? I mean, it's impossible for two guys to have the same relative rates of between two goods, right? So comparative advantage already. It's impossible. It's just like a continuous distribution. The chance that you land on a real number, the same real number is essentially zero, right? If you integrate from 0 to 0, it's if you integrate from A to A, which is a real number, it's always going to be 0, right? In other words, in a probability distribution especially. So axiom, the law of diminishing marginal utility is always the case. I don't know about that. I don't know what I was thinking there. Comparative advantage is legitimate. Law of diminishing marginal utility when you take into account the strong relative. Yeah, it's legitimate. Law of diminishing marginal utility doesn't apply to utility itself because of the primary objective. Yeah. Oh yeah. So you see here, this is profound because all goods are just a means toward utility. But when you analyze utility itself, there is no diminishing marginal returns to utility, which is your primary objective, because it's your primary objective. It's something you want to maximize to infinity. Okay, so I might get into that, but that's very profound. I think I came with that up today. This is a list I composed with over like a month. I'm just getting inspired. Lately, I've been inspired lately, but so I came with this probably today. Axiom, monopoly and the partial value of utilitarianism condition. What was I getting there? Monopoly and the partial value of utilitarianism. Partial value of utility. So utilitarianism has some value. Intuitive. Sometimes we find ourselves making a utilitarian argument, like the deadweight loss of taxation. It's not good for everybody, right? Okay, so I think that's where I'm getting there. The deadweight loss due to monopoly. So coercive monopoly is inherently bad. Monopoly in general is not inherently bad. I think I discussed that, but I might get into another presentation. Okay, whatever. Deduction. Okay, so here's one of my quote unquote rough theorems. All subjective probability is this is actually somewhat mathematical. I've learned this in probability. All subjective probability is conditional upon I formulated my own phrasing of this. All subjective probability between 0 and 1, or what you think the probability of an event will be, is conditional upon information intelligence. That's obvious, right? So the more information you get, the more intelligence you get, the more you can eliminate the possibility if it's 0 or 1, and you'll get closer to one or the other. The more information, the more intelligence. It's a function of two. It's a multivariable function of two variables: information and intelligence, quality and quantity of each. Right? I'm not sure if there's quality and quantity are ultimately the same, but anyways, we'll get into that much. Deduction. Here's another rough theorem. Subjective value. So what you think the value of an action is a function of what determines it is your information and intelligence to try to estimate true or relative value. Therefore, price, which is different than value. Price is, there's several prices, and the highest price you're willing to pay, the highest price the seller is willing to sell at, the bargain for negotiation price, or the marketing. So many prices. It's endless, but I like to define them specifically, so because I want to make clear distinctions for analysis. Therefore, price is a composite function of both the relative value of consumer and producer, right? Even though price is directly determined by subjective value is determined by relative value. It's a function of relative value. Therefore, price is transitively a function of relative value. So you can see it's a composite function there. So deduction, composition, and the proportion of causality causes convergence in the long run. So some variables have more effect or more dominant than other variables, right? And as you go to infinity, something dominates in something. So causes convergence in the long run. Oh, okay, so what I was getting here is that as time goes to infinity, as we go further and further into the future, subjective value will become better. Obviously, people will get smarter, information will get cheaper, and so subjective valuation will become more accurate. And even though it changes, relative value, subjective will become more accurate in determining relative value, even though relative value fluctuates through time. It doesn't change, it fluctuates, because it's not the same relative value given a time component. So parasitic effect, okay, this is the mechanism for evolution. So I claim that bad meta-self components attach itself to superior meta-self components. It's another way of explaining the mechanism of evolutionary pressure. Like ugly people, ugly will attach itself to high IQ. So over time, you'll see, if you analyze an inferior meta-self component, you'll find that they're smarter just because they're at a disadvantage and need compensating factors like IQ to compensate for their disadvantage. But ultimately, it'll go extinct. I don't know, I'll get into that in another video. So the smarter the meta-self, the more inferior the rest of it is. That's another way of phrasing that. It's pretty profound. Think about that. Subjective values must converge to relative value. I think I talked about because of evolutionary pressure. Relative value dominates the objective value and price function as t goes to infinity. I've talked about that. Subjective probability, subjective value, expected value are dependent upon info. Okay, yeah, it's redundant. Obviously, you can see I just want to get this out. Relativity has to do with determinism in that it is a mathematical relation function of the variables that determine its mechanical subjective. The subjectivity of products is just noise. So opinion is ultimately just noise. We're really concerned with what actually is. And utilitarianism says normative is a subset of positives. The universe is determinate, therefore value is objective. Morality is what an omniscient or perfect actor would do in the meta-self, in that meta-self perspective. Rationality, nature punishes irrationality. Proportionally, irrationality is the same as profitability. Nature can never select for non-existence. There's a contradiction here somewhere. You can see I'm just going down my rough ideas I just jotted down. For every given state of resources and technology, there is a finite carrying capacity, L. L, which is a function of technology and other things. Scarcity will always exist, and so will economics for all those zeitgeisters and post-scarcity economics, that voodoo crap. There will always be the periphery in society that barely survive. And you can't do this, right? You try to distribute goods equally, you necessarily kill, or you don't see the people that cannot exist in this society, and that's a hidden opportunity cost in egalitarianism, right? When you in communism, more people can survive in free market than in communism, even though you distribute goods equally, even though everyone has the same standard of living. What you don't see is the people that could have survived on the peripheries, which is probably a lot more. Strong version of explaining, okay, strong says law. I was playing with that. What was I going with there? I don't know. I'm too tired. It's late. Oh, defined definition for much work as a point. Yeah, I talked about any deviation from optimal strategy results in economic loss to the meta-self. Economic, I adopt the definition of economic loss, right? Including opportunity cost versus nominal loss. Morality can be only valued from, okay. Everything is universal viewed from the proper perspective. Just like relativity, right? Relativity, Einsteinian relativity, height, weight, these are not universal. They're different for different observers, and I just extrapolate that to morality. Not induction. Well, it's just the golden rule is an act of projecting your meta self in. So Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Yeah, that's a mistake, fallacy. It's projecting your meta self onto other actors, violating one of the axioms of value. Not important. Value is objective. This means morality is also objective, right? So I'm not a subjective value tard here, right? Subjective value tards, if they really believe value is ultimately subjective, and that's not price, right? Even price is objective, but then you must necessarily believe in moral relativism the way it's defined in philosophy. Please, and I distinguish between subjective and relative. Totally two different terms in my philosophy. Value of an action to a meta self is how well the action or strategy perpetuates instances of one meta self, obviously. Evolution exists so this, and it gave us morality for a reason. So this is how I constructed my philosophy. I looked at it from the perspective that I forget what morality is. Why do we have morality? It's just a tool that evolution gave us in order to help us determine what it selects for. This is the ultimate foundation of ego-utilitarianism or egoism. Concepts exist by default. I think it's conservation of finite energy in the universe. What was with that? I don't know. I'll have to refine all of this. It'll be refined as we go throughout. I just want to get this out there. Human action will converge to whatever morality is. Okay. Opinions reference other objects. If it references itself, it is either true by default or a contradiction. Okay. There is no is-ought dichotomy. Oughts are optimal strategy in pairwise or in pairwise. So oughts are optimal strategy. That is what is with respect to a well-defined objective. And I give a well-defined objective, the primary objective, perpetuating one's meta self, instances of one meta self. So all strategies, values are determined. So oughts are descriptions of the optimal strategy. They are ises. Rights or desires mean nothing without enforcement. I don't believe in rights. Rights don't mean, they're nonsensical, if not totally useless, right? They're totally useless, if not nonsensical, contradictory. The life of a meta self is determined by its instances, existence. The meta self is the smallest of the subjective subset of objective, right? So if you analyze my definition, that objective is anything to do in reality, it's an object. Subjective is created by the mind, right? You'll see its subset. Because anything created by the mind is an object in reality. There's also non-subjective, which is anything not created by the mind. Right? And I separate intelligence versus perception. Intelligence is actually the mind. Right? That's what I call it. So the utilizer of a so I have definitions of property. I have the exclusion criteria. The utilizer of property has an absolute advantage in owning it. I'll get into this. This is one of my rough ideas. Why I put this here? Being aware of being aware of the meta self is meta sentience, meta consciousness. I don't know. Come up with terms. Preference is substantiated through action. Right? It makes no sense to say you prefer something and do something else. It contradicts you. So, again, it has to do with relativity. It doesn't make sense to prefer someone else's action. Again, morality must be evaluated from the actor's perspective. Perpetuate the instance of the message. Cost benefit is a linear combination or weighted average of all mutually exclusive meta selves. No true contains a possibility of neither. No true statement contains, I don't know. If liars spread, oh, that's good enough for now. I'm getting tired. But hopefully this gives you somewhat a rough idea. For those of you really smart, you'll see kind of like the mathematical structure in this, where I'm really attempting to apply game theory in the future. Okay, thanks for watching. trust me, this will evolve. This will get cleaner. I'll edit this. This is just brainstorming here. I just want to get it out on video. For anyone interested, as of this moment, which I doubt, I have a few people that are interested, genuinely, but maybe you'll extract something from this. Hopefully, it'll be refined. If you can see any problems with it, comment down below. I address almost all comments. Thanks for watching.